The lecture hall buzzed with quiet conversation as students from 12 different species took their seats. Dr. JunkHFY adjusted his teaching robes and looked out at the mixed crowd. His four eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on the small group of humans sitting in the back corner. Those humans. They had been nothing but trouble since the Galactic Council decided to let Earth join 6 months ago. Dr. JunkHFY believed it was a mistake. Humans were too young, too primitive, too aggressive. They had barely figured out space travel when the Council found them. Most species took thousands of years to develop proper technology. Humans had done it in just a few hundred. Today we will discuss the classification of intelligence levels among galactic species, Dr. JunkHFY announced. His voice carried easily through the room thanks to the translation devices everyone wore. As you know, the Council uses a scale from 1 to 10 to measure technological advancement and problem-solving ability. A Centauri student raised one of her long arms. Professor, where do humans rank on this scale? Dr. JunkHFY's mouth curved. Into what other species had learned was not a friendly expression. That is an excellent question. The Council gave humans a preliminary rating of 6. However, I believe this rating is far too generous. Jake Morrison shifted in his seat. He was one of 3 humans attending the university as part of an exchange program. Back on Earth, he had been a military engineer who specialized in building things with whatever materials he could find. The other students called him quiet, but Jake was just listening and learning. Humans show promise in certain areas, Dr. JunkHFY continued. They can be creative when pressed, but they lack the sophisticated thinking that marks truly advanced species. They are scavengers by nature. They take things apart and put them back together without understanding the deeper principles. A human student named Lisa Carter stood up. Professor, isn't that exactly how innovation works? Taking existing ideas and combining them in new ways? Dr. JunkHFY's 4 eyes focused on her. True innovation requires understanding fundamental principles first. Humans skip this step. They jury-rig solutions without proper knowledge. This approach works for primitive problems, but it fails when facing real challenges. The room grew quiet. Several alien students looked uncomfortable. They had worked with humans on various projects and found them to be clever partners. But Dr. JunkHFY was a respected professor with 50 years of experience. I will prove my point, Dr. JunkHFY said suddenly. The university has a wilderness survival simulator. We use it to test the problem-solving abilities of different species. I propose a simple challenge. He walked to the front of his desk and looked directly at the human students. We will place 1 human in the simulator with a collection of broken technology from various species. Junk that our engineering department considers worthless. The temperature will be set to -40 degrees Celsius. The human must build adequate shelter and survive for 7 standard days. Jake felt his pulse quicken. This was clearly meant to embarrass humans in front of the other species. But it also sounded like exactly the kind of challenge he had trained for his entire career. What do we get when we succeed? Jake asked, standing up slowly. Dr. JunkHFY blinked his upper eyes in surprise. When you succeed? You are very confident. For someone about to face impossible odds. Just answer the question, Jake said calmly. If somehow you manage to survive and build adequate shelter, I will publicly acknowledge that humans deserve their council rating. But when you fail, Earth status will be reviewed. The Council needs to see that humans are not ready for galactic society. Jake looked at his fellow humans. Lisa nodded at him. The third human, a young man named Rick Torres, gave him a thumbs up. Jake had told them stories about building shelters in Alaska using nothing but crashed helicopter parts and some tools. I accept your challenge, Jake said. The room erupted in surprised chatter. Students from different species began talking excitedly in their own languages. Dr. JunkHFY raised his hand for silence. Excellent, the professor said. We will begin tomorrow morning. I will personally oversee the challenge to ensure fairness. The entire exercise will be recorded for academic study. After class, Jake met with the other humans outside the lecture hall. Lisa looked worried. Jake, are you sure about this? None of us know how alien technology works. What if they're junk? Really, it's just junk? Jake smiled. Lisa, I once built a working heater out of a broken truck engine and some aluminum cans. Technology is technology. The principles are the same everywhere. Heat, electricity, structure, insulation. I just need to figure out how their stuff does what our stuff does. Rick shook his head. But what if you're wrong? This could affect all humans in the galaxy. Then I better not be wrong, Jake said simply. That evening, Jake sat in his small dormitory room and thought about the challenge ahead. He had survived in the wilderness of Earth using makeshift equipment many times. But Earth wilderness was familiar. He knew what to expect, what materials he might find, how things worked. Tomorrow he would face an alien environment with alien technology. Everything would be different. But as Jake thought about it, he realized that Dr. JunkHFY had made one crucial mistake. The professor assumed that alien technology would be too advanced and complex for a human to understand. But Jake had learned long ago that all technology, no matter how sophisticated, had to follow the same basic physical laws. Energy could not be created or destroyed. Heat flowed from hot to cold. Strong materials could support weight. If the alien junk had once been working technology, then it had components that generated power, moved heat, provided structure, and controlled systems. Jake's job was to figure out which pieces did what, and then put them together in new ways. Dr. JunkHFY thought he was setting an impossible task. But Jake realized the professor had actually given him the perfect opportunity to show what humans could really do. Jake smiled and began planning for tomorrow's challenge. The transport vehicle dropped Jake at the edge of the wilderness simulator just as the artificial sun began to dim. Cold wind immediately cut through his standard university jacket. He pulled the collar up and looked around at his new environment. The simulator stretched out like a frozen wasteland. Snow covered everything as far as he could see. Bare rocks stuck up through the white ground like broken teeth. The wind howled across the open space, carrying tiny ice crystals that stung his face. 20 meters away sat a large pile of what Dr. JunkHFY had called worthless junk. Even from a distance, Jake could see pieces of metal, strange-shaped objects, and things that might have been electronic devices. The pile was bigger than he had expected, maybe 4 meters wide and 2 meters tall. Above him, a platform floated in the air using some kind of anti-gravity technology. Jake could see Dr. JunkHFY and several other professors standing behind. Clear walls, staying warm while they watched. Students from different species crowded around viewing screens. They all expected to watch him fail. Jake checked the small device clipped to his jacket. It would monitor his vital signs and let the professors know if he was in real danger. The simulator was designed to be challenging but not deadly. Still, minus 40 degrees could kill him quickly if he made mistakes. He walked to the junk pile and began his examination. The first thing he noticed was how different everything looked from human technology. Where human devices usually had straight lines and simple shapes, this alien technology curved and twisted in ways that hurt his eyes to follow. Jake picked up what looked like a power cell from a species he did not recognize. It was the size of a football, but weighed almost nothing. When he shook it gently, something liquid moved inside. The surface felt warm to his touch, which was encouraging. If it still held energy, he might be able to use it. Next, he found a flat sheet of material that bent like rubber, but felt as strong as steel. It was dark blue with a surface that seemed to shift color when he moved it. Jake guessed it came from Storie technology based on stories he had heard. The material could be useful for insulation or even structure if he could figure out how to work with it. Deeper in the pile, Jake discovered several metal beams that were clearly meant for construction. They had connection points that looked like they could link together. Though the joining mechanism was unlike anything from Earth, the metal itself was incredibly light but rang like a bell when he tapped it, suggesting it was very strong. The watching professors began talking among themselves as Jake methodically sorted through the junk. Most species would have immediately tried to activate devices, or started building without understanding what they had to work with. Jake was doing something different. He was creating an inventory. For the next 2 hours, Jake examined every piece of technology in the pile. He found things that generated heat, things that stored power, things that seemed designed for structure, and things he could not identify at all. But even the mysterious objects gave him clues. Heavy pieces were probably structural. Light pieces with complex surfaces were probably electronic. Things that felt warm probably still had power. Dr. JunkHFY watched with growing confusion as Jake laid out the alien junk in organized groups. The human was not panicking or rushing to build something immediately. Instead, he was treating each piece like a puzzle to be solved. "What is he doing?" asked Dr. Veltar, a Rigelian engineering professor who had come to watch. "I believe he is cataloging the available resources," Dr. JunkHFY replied. "But this approach will waste valuable time. He should be building shelter before the temperature drops further." Jake did not seem worried about time. He had found something very interesting buried in the pile. It was a cylindrical device about the size of a trash can, covered in symbols he could not read. But when he put his hand near one end, he could feel heat radiating from it. This was definitely some kind of heating unit, probably Altarian based on its design. The problem was that it seemed to be damaged. One side was cracked and several components were missing. Most people would consider it useless. But Jake had spent years fixing broken equipment with whatever parts he could find. He began to examine other devices, looking for components that might work with the heating unit. A damaged Centauri communication device had power regulation circuits that looked compatible. A broken piece of Rigelian transportation technology had connection cables that might fit as the temperature continued to drop. Jake started drawing in the snow with a stick. The watching aliens were puzzled by this behavior. Jake was creating a plan, sketching out ideas for how to combine different technologies. His drawing showed a small but efficient shelter design. The Altarian heating unit would sit in the center, modified with parts from other devices to make it work properly. The Rigelian construction beams would form the frame. The Centauri biopolymer sheets would provide insulation and weather protection, but Jake was planning something the alien observers had never seen before. He was designing a shelter that would use technology from multiple species working together. Each piece would do what it did best, combined in ways that none of the original designers had ever intended. Dr. Veltar leaned closer to his viewing screen. Is he really planning to integrate Altarian thermal technology with Rigelian structural systems? That is impossible, Dr. JunkHFY said quickly. Different species use incompatible power standards, connection methods, and control systems. Their technologies cannot work together. But look at his drawing, Dr. Veltar pointed out. He seems to think they can. Jake finished his planning and stood up. Snow had begun falling harder, and the wind was getting stronger. The temperature reading on his monitor showed -42 degrees. It was time to start building. He picked up the broken Altarian heating unit and carried it to the spot he had chosen for his shelter. The location was slightly downhill from the junk pile, which would provide some protection from the wind. A large rock formation nearby would serve as a windbreak for one side of his shelter. Jake began to work, and the professors above realized they were about to witness something unprecedented in galactic history. Jake dragged the broken Altarian heating unit to his chosen spot and set it down carefully. The device was heavier than it looked, but he could still feel warmth coming from its core. Whatever power source it used was still active, just not connected properly to the heating elements. He went back to the junk pile and gathered the Rigelian construction beams. The metal was strange to work with. It felt almost alive under his hands, warm despite the freezing air. When he found the connection points on each beam, they seemed to recognize each other and wanted to link together. The watching professors were fascinated by what they saw next. Jake did not try to force the alien connections to work the way human technology would. Instead, he watched how the beams wanted to connect and worked with their design. Within minutes, he had assembled a basic frame that was stronger and more stable than anything the professors expected. How did he learn to use Rigelian construction methods so quickly? Dr. Veltar asked. Dr. Zethkari frowned. He is not using proper methods. He is just experimenting until something works. But Jake was doing more than experimenting, he was learning. Each piece of alien technology had its own logic, its own way of working. Instead of fighting against these designs, he was adapting his human knowledge to work with alien principles. The frame complete, Jake turned his attention to the heating unit. This would be the hard part. He needed to fix the broken connections and jury-rig a power system using components from other species. He opened the damaged side of the unit and looked inside. The internal structure was completely unlike any human technology he had seen, but the basic function was clear. Power came in through one set of connections, got regulated by control circuits, and then flowed to heating elements that warmed the air. The problem was that several of the control circuits were missing and the power input was damaged. Jake needed to build new control circuits and create a way to connect different types of power sources to the unit from the communication device. He carefully removed small components that looked like they might regulate power flow. The pieces were tiny and delicate, designed for handling data signals rather than heating power. But Jake thought he could modify them. Working with alien technology was like solving a puzzle where he could only guess at the rules. Nothing was labeled in any language he could read. He had to figure out what each component did by testing it carefully and watching how it behaved. Jake found a way to connect the Centauri power regulation circuits to the Altarian heating unit using cables from the Rigelian transport device. The connections did not fit perfectly, so he had to create adapters using pieces of conductive metal he found in the junk pile. The professors watched in amazement as Jake solved problem after problem. When power voltages did not match between systems, he built voltage converters using components from 3 different devices. When connection ports were incompatible, he created adapters that bridged the gaps. "This is impossible," Dr. Zethkari muttered. "He is connecting technologies that were never designed to work together." "But it is working," Dr. Veltar pointed out. "Look, he just got the heating unit to activate." Jake smiled as warm air began flowing from the repaired heating unit. The temperature around him immediately became more comfortable. But he was not done yet. A working heater was just the beginning. He began installing the Centauri biopolymer sheets around his frame. The material was difficult to work with at first. It stayed stiff in the cold and did not want to conform to the shape he needed. But Jake noticed that the heating unit gave off energy in more than just heat. There was some kind of sonic vibration as well. Jake experimented with positioning pieces of the biopolymer material near the heating unit. When the vibrations hit the material at the right angle, it became soft and moldable. He could shape it into exactly the forms he needed for walls and insulation. The watching aliens had never seen anything like this. Jake was not just using the alien technologies for their intended purposes. He was discovering new capabilities by combining them in ways their original designers had never imagined. As Jake worked, he began to understand something important about the different alien species. Each group seemed to focus on perfecting individual technologies rather than combining different approaches. Altarians built excellent heating systems. Rigelians created superior construction materials. Centaurians developed amazing adaptable substances. But none of them seemed to think about putting these technologies together. Humans were different. They had learned to survive by combining whatever they could find into solutions that worked. Jake was applying this same approach to alien technology, creating something entirely new. His shelter began to take shape as evening approached. The frame was solid and flexible, able to bend with the wind rather than breaking. The heating system was working better than Jake had hoped, providing steady warmth throughout the internal space. The biopolymer walls were taking shape, forming an insulated barrier that kept the heat inside and the cold outside. But Jake was not satisfied with just basic survival. He could see other possibilities in the remaining junk. Why build a simple shelter when he could create something remarkable? He found components that could store and distribute power more efficiently. He discovered materials that could reflect heat back into the shelter instead of letting it escape. He even found pieces that might work together to create a backup heating system in case his primary unit failed. Dr. JunkHFY watched with growing unease as Jake continued to improve his shelter design. This was supposed to be a simple survival test that would prove human limitations. Instead, Jake was demonstrating capabilities that challenged everything the professor thought he knew about intelligence and innovation. Night fell, and the temperature dropped to -50 degrees. Jake sat comfortably inside his shelter, making final adjustments to his systems while the professors huddled in their heated observation platform, wondering what impossible thing the human would do next. Jake woke up on his third morning in the simulator to the sound of howling wind. Through the transparent section of his shelter wall, he could see snow blowing sideways across the landscape. The weather monitoring system was announcing an incoming storm that would bring the temperature down to -60 degrees on the observation platform. The professors watched their instruments with concern. Dr. JunkHFY had expected Jake to fail by now, but the human was not only surviving but seemed comfortable in his makeshift shelter. The storm approaching would be the real test. "Perhaps we should end the experiment," suggested Dr. Morix, a Centauri professor who specialized in extreme weather survival. "No species can survive in those conditions without proper equipment." Dr. JunkHFY shook his head firmly. The human accepted the challenge, knowing the risks. "We will continue as planned." Jake stepped outside his shelter to examine the approaching storm. The wind was already strong enough to knock him over if he was not careful. Snow was falling so hard he could barely see 10 meters in any direction. But instead of retreating into his shelter to wait out the storm, Jake began checking his systems for weaknesses. The heating unit was working well, but Jake realized it might not be enough for the extreme cold coming. He needed to improve his design quickly. Fortunately, he had been thinking about this problem and had some ideas. Jake went back to the junk pile, now partially buried in snow. He dug through the remaining pieces until he found what he was looking for, a collection of small devices that seemed to generate their own heat when activated. They were probably emergency heaters from some kind of spacecraft. The challenge was connecting these backup heaters to his main system. They used a completely different type of power connection and seemed to operate on different principles than his Altarian heating unit. But Jake had learned that alien technology often worked in unexpected ways. He brought the small heaters back to his shelter and began experimenting. Each one activated differently. Some responded to pressure, others to electrical current, and one seemed to work when he breathed on it. Jake realized these were personal heating devices designed for different species with different body chemistries. Working quickly as the storm grew stronger, Jake created a network of small heaters throughout his shelter. He could not connect them all to his main power system, but he found other solutions. The pressure-activated heaters could be triggered by weights he made from rocks. The breath-activated one responded to the warm air from his main heating unit. Dr. Veltar watched in fascination as Jake improvised solutions faster than seemed possible. How is he learning to use technology from 6 different species so quickly? "He is not learning proper operation," Dr. JunkHFY insisted. "He's just making random connections until something works." But Jake's approach was not random at all. He was applying basic engineering principles that worked across all technology. Every device needed input, processing, and output. Every system needed power, control, and function. The specific methods might be different for each species, but the underlying principles were universal. The storm hit with full force just as Jake finished installing his backup heating systems. Wind speeds reached over 200 kilometers per hour. The temperature dropped to -62 degrees. Snow fell so thick that the observation platform's cameras could barely see Jake's shelter. Inside the shelter, Jake monitored his systems carefully. His main heating unit was working harder than before, but still maintaining comfortable temperatures. The backup heaters were providing additional warmth in the corners where cold air might collect. Everything was working as planned. But then disaster struck. A massive gust of wind shook the entire shelter, and Jake heard the sound of something breaking. One of his power connections had failed, and his main heating unit began to shut down. The professors leaned forward, expecting to see Jake finally fail. The temperature inside his shelter would drop quickly without the main heater. He would have to signal for rescue within minutes. Instead, Jake calmly activated his backup systems. The small heaters throughout the shelter came online, each one contributing heat in its own way. The temperature dropped, but not dangerously. Jake had anticipated this exact problem and prepared for it. While the storm raged outside, Jake worked to repair his main heating unit. The broken connection was hard to reach and difficult to fix in the cramped space of his shelter. But he had brought spare components inside earlier, knowing that repairs might be necessary. Using tools he had improvised from alien junk, Jake rebuilt the damaged connection using parts from 3 different devices. The work was delicate and time-consuming, but he had all night to complete it. The professors watched in amazement as Jake's shelter not only survived the storm, but maintained steady internal temperatures throughout the night. His backup systems worked exactly as he had designed them to. When morning came, his main heating unit was working better than before. Dr. JunkHFY found himself facing uncomfortable questions from other faculty members. How had a supposedly primitive human created a shelter system that performed better than standard emergency equipment used by advanced species? His approach is fundamentally different from ours, Dr. Veltar observed. We design single-purpose systems that work perfectly under expected conditions. He designs adaptive systems that continue working when conditions change. Jake emerged from his shelter the next morning and began making additional improvements. He had noticed that his heating system was generating more power than he was using, so he started working on new projects. Using leftover components, he built a water collection and purification system that turned snow into drinking water. He created a small food heating station that could warm the emergency rations he had been given. Most impressive of all, Jake constructed a communication device that let him send messages to the observation platform. His first message was simple. Everything working fine? Storm was interesting? Thank you for the challenge. Dr. JunkHFY stared at the message in disbelief. Jake was not just surviving an impossible test. He was treating it like an enjoyable engineering project. On the 7th and final day, Jake stood outside his shelter watching the sunrise. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape covered in fresh snow that sparkled in the morning light. His shelter looked nothing like what he had started with a week ago. What began as a simple survival structure had become something remarkable. The observation platform descended from its high position as professors and students gathered to examine Jake's creation. Dr. JunkHFY stepped off the platform first, his expression unreadable. Behind him came Dr. Veltar and a dozen other faculty members from various species. The challenge period is complete, Dr. JunkHFY announced formally. You have survived the required 7 days. Jake nodded and gestured toward his shelter. Would you like to see how it works? The professors exchanged glances. They had been watching from a distance, but none of them had expected an invitation to inspect the shelter up close. Dr. Veltar stepped forward eagerly. We would be very interested in seeing your construction methods, the Rigelian professor said. Jake led them to his shelter and opened what served as a door. Warm air flowed out immediately, carrying with it the scent of clean, heated air. The professors stepped inside and found themselves in a space that was not only warm but comfortable. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. Jake had used the curved properties of the Centauri biopolymer walls to create more internal space without requiring additional structural support. The heating system hummed quietly in the center, surrounded by the network of backup heaters Jake had installed during the storm. This is impressive work, Dr. Veltar admitted, but I do not understand how you connected the Altarian thermal core to the Rigelian power distribution system. These technologies use completely different energy standards. Jake smiled and pointed to a series of small devices arranged between the main components. I'd built converters using parts from the communication equipment. The Storie data processors can handle the voltage differences if you modify their input circuits. Dr. JunkHFY examined the converter system closely. Each piece was clearly improvised from components that were never meant to work together. But the connections were solid and the power flow was steady. The human had created technology that none of his own engineers would have thought possible. "Show me the backup heating system," Dr. JunkHFY said quietly. Jake demonstrated how each of the small heaters worked independently while contributing to the overall system. The pressure-activated units were triggered by carefully balanced rocks that moved with air currents. The breath-activated heater was positioned to respond to warm air from the main system. Others were connected to different sensors Jake had built from various electronic components. "You created a completely redundant system," Dr. Morix observed. "If any part fails, the others continue working." "That was the idea," Jake agreed. "On Earth, we learned that simple systems break down. But if you have multiple simple systems supporting each other, the overall result is very reliable." Dr. Veltar was examining the construction beams that formed the shelter's frame. "These connections are not standard Rigelian assembly methods." "No," Jake said. "I noticed the beams wanted to connect in a specific way, so I worked with their design instead of fighting it. The result is stronger than what I could have built using human methods." The professors spent an hour examining every aspect of Jake's shelter. They found innovations in the power management system that could improve their own technology. The heating distribution was more efficient than standard Altarian designs. The structural modifications represented advances in Rigelian engineering principles, but what impressed them most was how Jake had made incompatible technologies work together seamlessly. The shelter represented something entirely new, a truly integrated system that combined the best features of multiple species technologies. When they finished the inspection, Dr. JunkHFY stood in front of the assembled group. His 4 eyes looked directly at Jake. "I must publicly acknowledge that you have not only completed this challenge, but exceeded every expectation," the professor said formally. "Your shelter demonstrates capabilities that challenge our fundamental assumptions about technological compatibility and adaptive engineering." Jake waited, sensing there was more to come. "Furthermore," Dr. JunkHFY continued, "I believe humans possess a form of intelligence that our current classification system cannot properly measure. Your ability to adapt existing technologies for new purposes represents a valuable skill that our civilization has been lacking." Dr. Veltar stepped forward. "The Rigelian Engineering Council would like to offer you a position as a visiting researcher. We are very interested in learning your integration methods." Similar offers came from the other professors. The Altarians wanted to study Jake's heating system improvements. The Centaurians were fascinated by his creative use of biopolymer materials. Even species that had not contributed technology to the junk pile wanted to collaborate with him. Dr. JunkHFY raised his hand for silence. "Before we discuss future opportunities, I have an announcement to make." He turned to address the cameras that had been recording the entire challenge. "Based on what I have observed over the past week, I am recommending that the Galactic Council revise the human intelligence classification upward. But more importantly, I am proposing the creation of a new classification category." The professors murmured with interest. New classification categories were extremely rare. "Humans should be classified as adaptive integrators," Dr. JunkHFY explained. "They possess a unique ability to combine existing technologies in innovative ways, creating solutions that exceed the capabilities of the original components. This skill appears to be fundamental to human thinking and could be extremely valuable for galactic civilization." Jake felt a surge of pride, not just for himself, but for his entire species. What Dr. JunkHFY had meant as a humiliating challenge had become proof that humans had something unique to offer the galaxy. "There is one more thing," Dr. JunkHFY said. "I would like to propose that you teach a joint course with me next semester. Adaptive Engineering, Human Methods for Technological Integration. I believe I have much to learn from your approach. Jake grinned and extended his hand for a handshake, a human gesture that Dr. Zethkari had learned during his preparation for the challenge. Professor, Jake said, I would be honored to teach alongside you. And I promise the first lesson will be about building things with whatever you have available. As they shook hands, Jake realized that his week in the wilderness had done more than prove human capabilities. It had opened the door for a new kind of cooperation between humans and aliens, one based on combining their different strengths to create something better than either could achieve alone.